This is an ancient altar, and this is Mamre.
Located in Israel, in the mountains west of the Dead Sea, is the ancient city of Hebron. About 2 miles south of Hebron is one of the most significant sites in all of the land of the Bible. And yet, hardly anyone visits this amazing place. We're going to deal with the archaeology by following the excavations of the first excavator of this site, a German archaeologist named Everett Mater.
Now this archaeological site, when Mater came here, was just a big mound, a small tell, and he excavated it layer by layer down.
And we're going to follow his excavations from 1926 to 1928 when he dug from the top of this tell all the way down to bedrock. Many of the archaeological remains Mater found can still be seen in the top plan from his excavations and at the site today. What did Mater find? He started digging in 1926. At the top layer of the tell, he uncovered these structures from the Islamic period. He could date them because he found the pottery and other finds that were associated with those architectural structures. Underneath that layer, he uncovered the foundations of a monumental building. He could identify the function of this building because at the front of the building was this half-circle-shaped structure, which is called an apse, pointing to the east. And this means that the function of this building was that it was a church. The pottery and other finds associated with it dated it to the Byzantine period, which makes sense because this is the Christian portion of the Roman Empire. We have to ask the question, why is there a church built at this particular place? Is it commemorating something? The layer beneath the church dated to the Roman period and included a late Roman channel.
So this aqueduct that we see here, this is from the late Roman period.
We have to ask ourselves, with this channel that takes a liquid out, what liquid is it bringing out? What is the purpose of this? What is going on here exactly? The next layer underneath this dates to the early Roman period, and this is when you have these monumental enclosure walls that enclose this site. Why is this little place enclosed with these walls? Are these fortification walls? Are these some kind of commemorative walls? These walls were built on bedrock, but outside of these walls on the western side, there was found 2 stone structures. The pottery and other finds dated them to the time of what's called the Iron Age, and this is the time when the kings ruled the kingdom of Israel. What were these structures? They're 2 square stone structures that are side by side. The oldest pottery dated back to the Bronze Age, to around 2000 BC. And it was in this earliest period that there was some kind of a structure at the center of the site. Sitting on the bedrock in the middle of the site is this corner of a stone structure. What was this? What is it doing in the middle of the site? Is it somehow connected to the later archaeology? Also in the bedrock itself are these huge holes.
We have this hole in the bedrock.
I remember the first time I went there and saw these, what on earth are these? And then in the southwest corner of the site, we have a strong water source. We have a spring.
This is a spring, and why this site has been used for thousands and thousands of years. You can see left over these stone mangers that are used for watering animals.
Okay, so that's what was found. So at this point, what we have is a bunch of facts. What we need is an interpretation that best explains all of this evidence, all of these facts. And so to do this, what we need are ancient accounts from these periods and from these ancient times that are telling us what this site is and telling us what was built here in the past and giving us the reasons for why it would be built here. The most important ancient texts between Mesopotamia and Egypt are the biblical texts. And so those are the ones that Mater used in order to bring out the meaning, the identification of what he had found in his excavations. If we bring one verse in, one verse from the Bible, then we all of a sudden go from confusion and speculation to all of a sudden a solid foundation for going, oh, so this is what this archaeological site is about. And that verse is Genesis chapter 13, verse 18, which says, "So Abraham went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord." So this verse says that there were great trees at Mamre. This was one of the distinctions of Mamre, was that you had these huge trees there. Well, is there any evidence for trees that would have stood 4,000 years ago?
What are these? Well, it was determined that this is where an ancient tree stood. In this part of the world, trees often grow up through the bedrock. And so even though we don't have the actual trees of Mamre anymore, they've long since perished, we have the footprints of where the trees once stood, and this is one of them. So this is a tree ring coming up from the ancient floor of Mamre.
This isn't surprising because right next to them is a spring. Also, Genesis 13:18 is significant for the location of the site that Mamre excavated. It says that Mamre is at Hebron. Now notice that it doesn't say in the city of Hebron within the fortification walls, but at Hebron, meaning the land that the city controlled. Abram, who later has his name changed to Abraham, who dwelt at Mamre, had these huge herds of animals, flocks of animals, and so he didn't live inside of cities. He lived in the land nearby those cities. Well, this particular site's location matches this because it's within 2 miles of Hebron. That would be in the land of Hebron. So we have, with this one verse, we have a match with the location. We have a match with the great trees and these holes in the bedrock. And then there's something else very significant mentioned in this verse. Abram was a nomad, and so he lived in tents, as it says here. And people who live in tents don't leave very much behind, and that's what archaeology is. It studies what's been left behind from the ancients who lived in these places. And so what would somebody living in a tent leave behind? Well, not much, unless they built something. And this verse identifies what Abram built at Mamre. He built an altar to the Lord. And so after Mamre had excavated all the way down, he realized that there was a center to this site. And the corner of this stone structure was part of what was left from the architecture that had stood at the center of the site, which he identified as an altar. He put a J over his top plan, and then he labeled that the foundations of Abraham's altar.
So this is the altar site, the site of Abraham's altar. Now, how did Mamre know that this is where Abraham had built his altar? Well, everything that comes after this archaeologically is built around this particular place. This is the center of the archaeological site of Mamre. Obviously, this altar would have been destroyed and rebuilt and repaired many, many times over the course of the last some 4,000 years. But we know from the site itself that this is the sacred place within the sacred site of Mamre. So this is what's left from the altar of Abraham, and this is the sacred place within the sacred place, which the whole site is built around.
And of course, of all the pottery that was found in his excavations, the earliest pottery came from the time period of the Bronze Age, which is dated in general to about 2000 BC. Well, this is the general date of the patriarch Abraham. And so the pottery dated it to the right time, and then these earliest finds connected it to Mamre. And so, based on the Bible And based on the site that he had excavated and what he had found and its location, he identified this as Mamre in the Bible. And what this means is that the events in Genesis that take place at Mamre happened in this place. And this is significant because these are the events that made this not just an ordinary place, not just a historically significant place because Abram camped here, but beyond that, it made it a sacred place. Now, another significant verse that we have to consider in order to not only understand the biblical account, but also to understand the archaeological site of Mamre is Genesis chapter 18, which begins by saying that the Lord appeared to Abraham at Mamre. So my book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence, I cover this site of Mamre in chapter 1 because this is one of the places where God came down, and the archaeological site of Mamre contains the archaeological evidence that was left behind from that event. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can order a copy of that book. And I make these videos to complement, hopefully, the material and information that's in the book, and then the other way around as well.
So what happened here? Well, this is the place where God appeared to Abraham and Sarah and made them the promise that they would have a son.
Genesis chapter 18 says, "Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed." The point is that this is what the Lord himself is doing through Abraham and Sarah. And then in verse 18, the Lord goes on and he says, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. This is deeply significant to not only understanding the biblical account, but for understanding the archaeological site of Mamre, because when this promise is given, Abraham is an old man with a barren wife. But you surely will become something more than what you are right now. And the same is true for the site of Mamre itself. At the time of this promise, Mamre is just a campsite. But if the Lord fulfills his promise to Abraham, then it will become more than just a campsite. It will become sacred ground to the great and powerful nation that Abraham becomes, and it will become significant also as the place of the promise that all nations on earth would be blessed through this promised offspring of Abraham. And that's exactly what we find in this stack of archaeology that's stacked up over the site of Mamre. The next layer up from this Abraham period layer are these two stone structures that Mamre found. So what are they? They're these two square stone structures with this passage in between. Mamre identifies them as the remains of a gate that led into an enclosure made in the Israelite period that then was destroyed and wiped out by the later building projects on that site.
I am near the southwest corner of Mamre, and just outside the Herodian period walls, when Mamre excavated right here, he exposed an earlier gate that led into a structure that was later destroyed when Herod the Great built up Mamre. And he dated this to the Kingdom of Israel period. In fact, he dated it to the time of David. He believed that David was the one who enclosed and commemorated this site, which makes sense because David ruled just less than 2 miles from here at Hebron for 7.5 years.
That wouldn't have been an altar that they would have used for sacrifices. It would have been Abraham's altar that they were then commemorating with this enclosure of sacred ground. Whatever king built this enclosure, the point is that this is archaeological evidence that comes from the time period of the Kingdom of Israel. They were the reality that the first part of the promise that the Lord gave Abraham at Mamre had been fulfilled. Abraham had become the great and powerful nation of Israel, who now was building and venerating the site where the promise of their very existence had been given in the past. And this also explains why this site also would be venerated at the time of the early Roman period when this was Judea. The parallel for this site is the walls at Jerusalem for the Temple Mount, and also the walls at Machpelah, the burial place for the patriarchs.
So one of the decorations that Herod the Great used at Mamre is what are called parapets, and they were decorations that resembled columns along these walls. And so we have them in the three places that Herod built up to please his Jewish subjects. We have them in Jerusalem at the Temple Mount, at Machpelah near here, and here at Mamre.
Based on these parallels, it's very reasonable for Mater to interpret that the builder of these enclosures was Herod the Great. So if we look at Lane Rittmeyer's reconstruction based on the archaeology, we see what the site looked like at this time, the time of Herod the Great, where we have these monumental walls that are enclosing the site, and then at the center of this enclosure we have what is being commemorated, and in this case it is the altar of Abraham. It's not being used by the Jews. The Jews do their sacrificing as they did in the Israelite period at the temple in Jerusalem. This is just commemorating the altar that was built by Abram at Mamre. We come to this channel that cuts through the early Roman wall. What was this used for? Well, we don't have to guess because we have a historical source that tells us. In AD 324, Constantine had won the East and had become then the sole emperor over the entire Roman Empire. And so the site of Mamre was now under his control. Around this time, his mother-in-law, Eutropia, had gone on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and one of the sites that she had visited was Mamre. And she was horrified when she visited this site because there was an altar that she saw, and it was being used by pagans in their worship. We have this preserved in a letter that Constantine sends, reporting what she had reported to him and giving his orders to the bishops in this area of what he wanted to happen to this site. Constantine wrote, "She assures me then that the place of Mamre, where we find that Abraham dwelt, is defiled. She declares that the idols which should be utterly destroyed have been erected on the site of that tree, that an altar is near the spot, and that impure sacrifices are continually performed." So then sometime after the time of Herod the Great, then the pagans began to use Abraham's altar as a sacrificial altar.
So this channel right here dates to the late Roman period, and one of the reasons why is because it cuts through this wall that was built by Herod the Great, so therefore it's later than the time of Herod the Great. What was its purpose? This is where the blood from the altar left the site. This came over to these ruins that we see right here. This is all that's left of the altar of Abraham.
Constantine also wrote of Mamre, "The place itself we have directed to be adorned with a church." And so Mater very well understands that the foundations of the Byzantine church that he found in his excavations is the physical evidence, the very church that is mentioned in Constantine's letter as being built in Mamre.
So I'm standing in the apse of a church. When I say the apse, I mean this half circle that you see right here outlined in stone. This is a Constantinian church. Constantine commissioned only 4 churches during his reign to be built in the Holy Land. And this is one of them, which shows the importance of this site of Mamre. Out of all of the Constantinian churches in the Holy Land, this is the one that you can walk around on and see the foundations of better than the others.
Mater noticed that the foundations of the church were unusually wide and not very long. He concluded that this was because it had been built between 2 pre-existing structures, the venerated altar to the west and Herod's enclosure wall to the east. This is Mater's reconstruction of Byzantine Mamre. with the commemorated altar in front of the church, and Herod's enclosure wall behind it. This is very significant because it has to do with the second part of the fulfillment of the promise that was given to Abraham at Mamre. All nations on earth will be blessed through you. And so now in the Christian Roman period, we have the reality of that coming to pass because we have a church building being built to worship Jesus, who blessed all nations on earth through the salvation that he provides. And those who receive that salvation are now making a pilgrimage from all these nations of the earth back to the place where that promise was given. Then we have the Islamic period veneration because Arabs also believe that their forefather is Abraham. And so we see this also in the Palestinian city of Hebron as it grew and expanded and took the archaeological site of Mamre within the city limits of Hebron. We see that the city didn't grow over the top of this site, but around this site. And in fact, the local government has preserved this site and made it possible today for people to come and visit it. Here I am with the Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who, like the majority of biblical archaeologists, believes Abraham was a myth. In his book, The Bible Unearthed, he writes, "Its finds have revolutionized the study of early Israel and have cast serious doubt on the historical basis of such famous biblical stories as the wanderings of the patriarchs. Some of the most famous events in the Bible clearly never happened at all." So if secular scholars are right and Abraham isn't a real person and the events that happened to him as recorded in the Bible never happened, then what is the explanation for the archaeological site of Mamre? Why did it grow over time? What was the inspiration that caused these archaeological layers to be stacked up one on top of another over literally thousands of years? If Abraham did not become a great and powerful nation, then why did the great and powerful nation of Israel, who claims to be the descendants of Abraham, why did they come and venerate this place and leave behind the archaeological evidence that they had done so? If Abraham had not become a blessing to all nations on earth, then why did people from all the nations on earth who had been blessed through salvation from the Messiah, who is the son of Abraham, come back on their pilgrimages to Mamre to venerate this place of promise? The best explanation for all that was found evidence-wise at Mamre is that the Bible is true, it's credible, it's historical, and that these people really lived and these events really happened. And that's why you have the stack of archaeology that was found there. These are the reasons why for many years I have been bringing my biblical study tours to Mamre.
And this is the sacred ground within the sacred ground. Who do you think Yahweh is when he appears here to Abraham and Sarah and makes them the promise? You think that's Yahweh the Father who's appearing to them? Or do you think that's Yahweh the Holy Spirit who's appearing to them? Wouldn't it be the image of the invisible God, Yahweh the Son, who was appearing to them and announcing ultimately the birth of himself?
So Jesus, the Messiah, the son of Abraham, who had become a blessing to all nations on earth by offering the forgiveness of sins and salvation, had thousands of years before, pre-incarnate, before he had become flesh, appeared to Abraham at Mamre to promise that he would have a descendant through Sarah who would become a blessing to all nations on earth. He promised Abraham that he would come through his lineage, through his descendants.
It's a great privilege that God has graciously given us to have the privilege to stand in a sacred place like this, where God made such a profound promise. We are the recipients of the blessing that Yahweh himself promised Abraham and Sarah in this place.
We are the inheritors of salvation that comes through the Messiah, the Son of Abraham. And so we are part of the fulfillment of the promise that was made some 4,000 years ago at Mamre. That's why it's a significant site even to us and even to us today. Don't forget to subscribe. I'll leave a link where you can order a copy of my book, and you can watch other videos right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.